Yes, like I was saying, it's another exciting event under the Institute of African Studies seminar series. Institute of African Studies is domiciled at the University of Ghana here at Legon, where all the important conversations happen. Today, we're excited to have Dr. Ebila, who has proposed a very interesting talk. I'll briefly introduce the chair in the person of Dr. Mrs. Mercy Ankrah. She's a senior research fellow here at the Institute of African Studies. And she's a member of the Language, Literature, and Grammar section. Her research interest covers areas in African linguistics, such as grammar of less studied language and language use in multilingual settings. In recent times, she has also been involved in the Institute's biographical research and the spearheading in general the IAS biographical research agenda. Maybe she would like to tell us something briefly about that before she introduces the guest speaker. She teaches courses at the undergraduate and graduate levels, and she is the coordinator of the Institute's master's program. Dr. Ankrah, maybe a word. I think you have been anchoring the biographical project in the last 4 or 5 years. There has been a mammoth publication out of that. Maybe you say a word briefly and then usher in the guest speaker. Since incidentally her work is around that same area. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Samba. Yes, the Institute of African Studies has institutionalized biographical research.
Yeah.
In 2015, we started the first phase. We did the first phase from 2015 to about 2018, and it was published in 2019. In the first phase, we studied 7 Ghanaian personalities, their lives and their times. And the second phase, we are studying 6 of them, 4 women and 2 men. And we have 9 of us doing that research. We hope that in about a year's time, we'll be ready and to be published as a book of about 6 chapters. So I'm very much interested and delighted to chair this presentation, which is also an aspect of biographical research. So with that, I introduce the speaker for this afternoon. She is Dr. Florence Ebila, who is a lecturer in the School of Women and Gender Studies, Makerere University, Kampala. Recently, she was in residence as a fellow at the Center for Gender Studies, University of Ghana, from May 2022 to June 2022, where she was researching and writing on the autobiography of Eleanor Maxine Ankrah, entitled Maxine, A Life Without Baggage. Ebila's interest in African women's autobiographies has spanned over a decade and seen her research on the question of identity, trauma, selfhood, and nationalism as represented by women in their autobiographies. Her doctoral studies was on African women's political autobiographies, and she continues to publish in this area. Some of her recent publications on African women include Memoir of Women in Conflict, Ugandan Ex-Combatants and the Production of Knowledge on Security and Peace Building, published in Security Dialogue. There's also Laws and Trauma in Ugandan Girls Ex-Child Soldier Autobiographical Narratives, the case of Grace Akalo and China K. Tichi, Journal of AB Autobiography Studies. And then A Proper Woman in the African Tradition, the Construction of Gender and Nationalism in Wangari Maathai's autobiography, About. Florence is a Fulbright scholar, a Cambridge African Research for Excellence postdoctoral fellow, an African Humanities Program postdoctoral fellow, and currently a Mellon Foundation Early Career Scholar. She is also a researcher at the Center of Excellence in Notions of Identities, Makerere University, and Center of Excellence for Urbanization and Habitable Cities at the University of Lagos, Nigeria, both under African Research Universities Alliance. Beyond academia, Dr. Ebila does research with NGOs and CBOs who work to advance women's empowerment and bring about gender equity. Her research interests are in the areas of gender, culture, feminist theory, feminist historiography, gender-based violence, post-colonial studies, media studies, and African literature and languages. So ladies and gentlemen, this afternoon we are privileged to have the scholar speak to us on the topic, Discrimination and Resilience in Maxine Ankrah's autobiography, Maxine, A Life Without Baggage. We are all eager to listen to this presentation. Dr. Ebila, you are welcome. You have about 40 minutes to do your presentation, after which there will be time for interaction. There's a session for questions, answers, suggestions, and so on. So without much ado, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Dr. Ebila to take the floor for her presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mercy Ansa. Thank you very much, the Center for Gender Studies and the Institute of African Studies at University of Ghana. I enjoyed staying at the center for a month where I was writing this paper. It's still work in progress, and I will be very, very grateful to listen to comments from you on the paper, especially on how I can improve on the paper. My research, as has been mentioned, is on Maxine Ankrah, and I want to share with you the screen and show you, I can't see my PowerPoint. It seems it's a little bit lost. So let me redo that again. Okay. So the research is on Maxine Ankrah's autobiography, which was written in 2018. Maxine Ankrah is an African-American who got married to a Ghanaian and lived in Ghana for some time. And then her work took her to Kenya and then to eventually to Uganda, where she has settled. I beg that I don't use my video because I have very poor internet, and I hope I don't get off. If I get off, please bear with me and come back because my internet is a little bit unstable. So the autobiography was published in 2018 by Fountain Publishers. And in terms of literary technique, it should actually be a biography, should have been a biography because she had two writers who helped her to write it, but that's contestable. The two writers were recording what she would say, and then she would sit with them, go through with them. So it's partly autobiographical, partly biographical. And the title of my talk, as I said, is Discrimination and Resilience in Ankrah's Autobiography, A Life Without Baggage. So I explore the two themes of discrimination and resilience, with looking at discrimination as an incurable cancer, something that has always been in society for a long time, and people are always trying to find a solution to it. You think you found a solution, but it keeps on emerging in different ways, especially now with COVID-19 coming in. There are various angles at which we see discrimination happening. So historicizing discrimination calls us to focus on historical debates that informs them. And we should be interested as scholars to find out, has anything changed? And what have we learned in history about discrimination, especially racial discrimination? We are at a point in history where racial discrimination seems to have re-emerged in a different way. There are many laws that have been put in place to stop discrimination, but we still find that there is a tension between whites and blacks, and it varies from one country to the other. Slavery and slave trade brought racial and class differences between black and white people. It has brought further differences that has continuously emerged in different ways on the African continent, as well as in America. We need to look beyond these racial differences and also look at other intersecting forms of differences like class, gender, ethnic differences as we diagnose various phases of discrimination and we try to find a solution. With the emergence of feminism, and as I look at this autobiography by a Black woman, I'm interested in finding out the various phases of discrimination that take place that are influenced by class, race, and gender. And depending on the location, when she lived in the United States of America, she was writing about different kinds of discriminations, mostly racial discrimination. When she was teaching in Makerere University, she was talking about subtle discrimination. And my interest therefore was piqued about, this is a Black woman in a Black community. So what forms of discriminations exist within intra-group where we have the same race? So it's important to study all these forms of discriminations in order to understand the impact it has on society, in order to build strategies and synergies to overcome them. And for Black people writing about discrimination and resilience, this helps to create strategies that can be used by people who read these books. I must say that when Ankrah was interviewed on one of the Ugandan newspapers, she said that she felt shy about talking about racial discrimination because she thought that her book would be thrown away and she wanted to talk about something else, but it was important, so she had to bring it out in her book. So what's the argument of my paper? Ankrah's autobiography, I argue, provides a good account of racial and other forms of discriminations and can be a source of learning reference in as much as it's a self-written narrative. The argument that people usually have about autobiography being a story of an individual and therefore being subjective and not relevant is therefore not applicable in my case. I argue that in the autobiography, readers are able to see the intersectionality of race, class, gender, and ethnicity, and how this affects the way Black women are discriminated against. And this cuts across, it's not an individual experience. It's therefore important to study personal narratives such as this, to learn how to navigate through the obstacles of discrimination and to unearth the structures of resilience that the author uses. I therefore argue that Ankrah's autobiography can be used as a tool for understanding the unique positions and relationships between Black people and white people, and also between Black people themselves, both on the African continent and outside Africa in Europe as well. In order to analyze this paper, I used Webb Du Bois' theory of double consciousness. And this helped me to explore the issue of racism and the identity of Black people, how they look at themselves. Webb Du Bois presented double consciousness as a feeling that develops a veil, makes the Black person look at themselves through the veil. And in other words, they can't see themselves without looking through the eyes of others as they look at themselves. So the self has this consciousness that is affected by what others looks at. In other words, the self has this peculiarity where there's a double edge when they are thinking about their activities. So he presents double consciousness as a condition in which Black or African Americans find themselves. Something has popped up and is a little bit closing my screen. I'll try to see if I can. Okay, let me continue. So in The Soul of Black Folks, he presents that double consciousness is a peculiar condition in which Black people, African Americans, find themselves, a condition that forces them to view their lives in two ways. To him, the African American harbors the feeling of doubleness of being Black in America, subjected to racism and looked at as inferior compared to the white African, to the white American. And yet, within themselves, they don't see anything, they shouldn't see anything that should make them less and make themselves think that they are subordinate. But this double consciousness also affects the sense of belonging. It's a feeling of belonging to a subordinate group that always will come in the consciousness of Black folks, making them conscious of this imposed inferiority. And as they interact with others, they are conscious about their skin color and how people treat them. Du Bois argues that the African American should not only be taught to yearn to look for money, but they should also focus on culture and education, which is very important for the development of the society and to take away this feeling of inferiority. And therefore, the binary image of the word African American itself is very important. That fracture, that division, African American, it has always caused a debate where sometimes people don't want to refer to themselves as African American, but rather as Black people living in America. It's a thing that continues to be debatable. I also use the theory of intersectionality, and this I borrow from Kimberly Crenshaw to analyze Ankrah's autobiography and presentation of discrimination. Intersectionality as a framework used to explain the multiplicity of discrimination that comes from class, race, sexuality, and gender, and how this affects Black women compared to other women, could be compared to white women, women of other origin. So intersectionality becomes very important, a lens which I use to understand Ankrah's position on discrimination. In terms of methodology, I did textual analysis. I looked at Maxine Ankrah's text and went through her presentation of the themes of discrimination in the text, doing a close reading of the text and applying the theory to the analysis of the text. So the research was mainly qualitative. Then at some point, I use discourse analysis to understand the letters, the exchange of the letters that she had between herself and the Makerere University administration when she was contesting some of the decisions that were being made by her head of department about whether she should get leave or she should be relieved of her position as a lecturer in the School of Social Work and Social Administration. So in analyzing discrimination and resilience, I start from the story that actually is the beginning of her presentation. Ankrah starts her story right with talking about racial discrimination. And on page 1, and I quote, she says, "Nevertheless, starting the story of my earliest years required a reflection or an examination of all the most critical influences. Beyond family and God, there were none more decisive than race and the inevitable racism of American context. Put differently, it's unimaginable that race and racism remain the most unchanged constant factors and forces influencing the context of my life from the 1930s through the 21st century to the present time, being 2018, when she wrote the autobiography." Starting her autobiography in this way makes us aware that racial discrimination was a very key area in her life. And actually, she goes on to talk about the forms of discrimination that Black people suffered in North Carolina, where she was born. Black people were not allowed to, did not have access. It's not that they were not allowed to. The laws were in place eventually that allowed them to own property, but their ownership of resources were constrained by the fact of their skin color. They could work in the shops of white people, but they did not have the resources to own their own shops. They could clean the swimming pools, and there were, she grew up during the Jim Crow era, where white people would not allow Black people to swim together in their swimming pool, where they were not allowed to ride the same buses until much later when there was the riot and Black people refused on the initiation of a Black woman to allow to be discriminated against while riding the bus. Same with housing. The neighborhood where Black people stayed was different and was less developed, while the neighborhood where white people stayed were more developed. Black people did manual labor and worked in the shops of the white people. And she, in the title of her autobiography, calls racism one of the baggages. And in writing about her life and situating it in the title, A Life Without Baggage, she's trying to communicate that she is overcoming this baggage of racism, and the process in which she overcomes the baggage of racism is what she talks about in the autobiography, her life story, how she faced the challenges. And this is what I refer to as the resilience. I quote again from the metaphors of racism. She says, "What made the greatest difference at the time," and that was between 1953 and 1957, was one's color. The baggage of racism. In the 1940s and the 1950s, one would be admitted usually to a totally Black school as well as to a Black church. Some of these experiences, if you compare them with Black women who are writing about the discrimination against Black people and how they experienced it as women, are similar. And I refer to Sindiwe Magona's autobiography, which talks about similar things. African women, the best they could do would be to work as maids. And the word maid tended to have a color context in them. If someone talked about a maid was considered Black, not white. So Magona also writes about working as a maid, and Ankrah writes about her work as a maid, which helped her to pay for her education because her parents were poor and they couldn't afford her education until when she got scholarships later. In other semi-autobiographical works of fiction, again by Sindiwe Magona, a South African, she writes about living, loving, and lying awake at night, where a collection of stories of people who worked as maids talked about this baggage of racism, where the best that Black women would do would be to work as maids. So this helped her develop resilience. And she said right from when she was a child, she had this mantra, I am ruled by purpose. And because she's ruled by purpose, she always aspired for the best, and that resilience was the one, that mantra helped her to fight against discrimination. Chika, could you remind me when it's 10 minutes to time? I don't think I would know very well.
Fine.
And I don't want to take a lot of time. Okay, thank you. And then she said another thing that guided her, that made her resilient, was her father's words. You can be what you want to be. And whenever she was faced by racism, she'd flash back to this. Self-drive and self-discipline, those also helped her to overcome and be resilient. And at times when it was impossible just to be quiet, she developed rebellion. And she gives an example of one time when she was working as a maid at a friend's place, a white woman's place, and she was paid less because of the color of her skin. She decided she was not going to accept that, and that was the last she worked there, she left. So rebellion, trying to be quiet and develop self-discipline was some of the tactics that she used. And when she thought that she needed to move to Africa, it was also partly her way of fighting discrimination. She wanted to come to Africa at that age when she was young, 26 years of age. And she thought that instead of fighting racism in the US, she wants to come and fight racism in Africa and drive white people back to their continent instead of fighting from America. So in her own way, that was her thoughts of racism, of resilience. And then I also want to talk about intra-racial discrimination. And this is a theme that I think makes Ankrah's autobiography very, very significant. When we talk about racism, we always talk about Black, white, other colors, but there's this form of discrimination that exists between Black and Black, and especially the Black African and the Black African American. And to critically analyze this, we need to look and compare similarities and differences of experiences of what Ankrah went through. She talks about her experience as a Ghanaian wife. When she came to Ghana at 26 years of age, she thought she had come home and she thought she would be embraced as a Black woman who has now come home, but she was being referred to as an American. And she felt hurt, she felt betrayed. Was that discrimination? We haven't theorized about that, but I thought that this is a very courageous autobiography that brings in these nuances that are always not talked about. The courage that she has to talk about her experience as a Black woman in Africa and how she felt out of place until when, through her resilience, she finds ways of dealing with this difference. And this, I refer to the literature that talks about the kind of dilemma that Black African Americans face when they come to the continent. In The Dilemma of a Ghost, Ama Ata Aido writes this play that talks about Eulelia, who is a bride who has come to Ghana and is married to Ato Quaison. And when eventually he comes and brings her home, she's so excited. She thinks she has come home, but the people at home in Ghana feel that she's actually not Black. They call her white. And so she feels out of place. So towards the end of the play, there's this dilemma. You can see the double consciousness that the Black African American is facing. You feel a sense of belonging, and yet you don't quite belong. So at the end of the play, the character is asking, Shall I go to Cape Coast? Shall I go to Elmina? Shall I? Where do I fit, in other words? So that image of slavery still keeps on hanging on onto the identity of the Black woman who comes to stay in Africa and thinks she has come home. So intra-racial discriminations or rejections, if we may call it, this is what perhaps we'll discuss later. Black Americans versus African Americans and the double consciousness and the veil that exists is there. And she talks about the various forms of this experience. Again, there's another semi-autobiographical work by Saidia Hartman, an African American who writes about her experience coming to Ghana and trying to trace her origin in the book, Lose Your Mother, The Journey Along the Atlantic Slave Trade. These are critical issues of identity that we need to look at. And how is she resilient? How does she fight this kind of consciousness where you feel that there's a sense of not belonging? She says she made a decision when she came and she felt that she was looked at as different. She said, what do I do in order to make me feel happy and at home in Africa? And through her resilience, she says, it was through a search for answers that I came to make peace with the reality that however long I stayed in Africa, I would never be considered an African. Moreover, or worse, Africans would never accept me as any other than an American, a foreigner. I could take it or leave it. That is, I could accept this reality or I could leave Africa. This was an insight arrived at in 1972. I chose to stay. So resilience as part of choice, we see her making a conscious choice to stay in Africa, and eventually she works in Ghana, and then she comes to Kenya working as a social worker with the government of Arab Moi in the 1970s. She also comes and works in Uganda during the Idi Amin regime, and people are asking her, how can an African American stay in Uganda when there's dictatorship in Uganda? But she decides to stay after making that conscious decision. Institutions. And here is when I try to talk about not intra-racial discrimination or racial discrimination, but I'm talking about this intersectionality of discriminations taking place within an institutional framework. And this mostly refers to our experience when she's a lecturer in Makerere University. The politics of academia influences Ankrah, and in her autobiography, she provides insights into understanding the politics behind teaching, research, and outreach, and the core values that academic institutions have, like in Makerere University. Ankrah taught at Makerere University in then Department of Social Work and Social Administration for many years, and she narrates her experiences teaching students and interacting with staff, and also her constant fights with the leadership of her unit. In most cases, the discrimination that was practiced against her was not direct discrimination. In fact, I failed to theorize this. At what point I'm thinking, is this discrimination or is this rejection? And we see the intersectionality of gender, of class, of ethnicity, but also in other institutions that she worked in, like with the UN, there's also the element of race that still comes in. And I asked the question, why did she suffer all these forms of discriminations? I flash back to the article by Folashade Hunsu, who discusses the identity question and says, for one to be accepted, one has to be looked at as proper. And also when I looked at the identity, the definition of a proper woman in Wangari Maathai's autobiography, it helps me to understand the kind of rejection that Ankrah faces when she is in Makerere. Ankrah does internal dialogues to discuss the contradictions and the dilemma that she goes through. And I asked the question, was she a proper African-American, or should we say, was she a proper Black female scholar in the eyes of the more male and masculine environment where she was teaching? In Makerere as an institution, what did Makerere expect of Ankrah? And how did she react to some of these institutional expectations? And finally, how did the, I have 10 minutes? No, someone else was saying something. Finally, how did the discriminations against her manifest themselves? The discriminations were subtle. And these were indirect discrimination. No one would come out and tell her anything directly, but the way she was treated in these three institutions, I think brings out the question of discrimination and subtle forms of discriminations, and calls upon us as scholars to try to identify this and see how to work to combat or to work against the forms of discrimination. So I'll look at the UN agency where she worked, where she did research for on HIV/AIDS. Then I'll look at Makerere University, and if time allows, her institution, the Ankrah Foundation, where she worked. And that's what I'm calling the gendered public. So intellectual recolonization as a form of discrimination, which is subtle. Ankrah did research on HIV/AIDS, and she came up with a publication. And in her autobiography, she says no one ever mentioned her findings. And she kept on asking herself, where did her research findings go? Because she sent the whole raw data, as is required of consultants. She sent it back to the UN agency, but nothing was mentioned about her findings. Then later, when Epstein, who wrote about HIV/AIDS in Africa, came, she told her, oh, I found your findings and you talked about behavioral change as essential to the combating HIV/AIDS. And then that's when she realized that was this a form of discrimination? Because when Ugandan success of fighting HIV/AIDS was being praised, it was about the A, B, C, and people in Ghana may not understand this: abstinence, be faithful, and use condoms. And no one talked about behavioral change. And yet in our research, she had found that behavioral change was actually the leading cause of reduction of cases of HIV/AIDS. So she thought, was my findings shelved because I was a Black woman? And that alone was a form of recolonization or discrimination against her, as I put it. Then we come to the institutional discrimination at Makerere University. This was characterized mostly by silence, and Ankrah, after winning several grants, needed an affiliation with Uganda Virus Institute. And when she was doing her research, she just realized that all of a sudden people were no longer talking to her like the way you normally talk to her. She was winning several grants, and she says, and I quote, "For an explanation that now escapes me, within a short period of time, Sama Gaba, who was a colleague of ours, and I began to sense that other academic staff, that is the gang around us or me, I'm not sure, was less than supportive of the progress being made in my settling in the Department of Social Work and Social Administration." So there was this silence and distance from her, the subtle discrimination that eventually made her, when she left Makerere, she asked herself, no one asked after her. It wasn't clear whether it was definitely not because of her teaching, because her students were very happy with her teaching. But later, she came to realize when she went away in 1977 and did her PhD and came back, that this was not just an honest way of keeping silence about her work. I'll talk about hierarchy of reporting in the next slide. So between 1977 and 1984, what she calls a middle passage, she went to Nairobi and did her PhD, and then she came back to Makerere University. And here, when she came back, she was more in touch with the administration. Whenever she would write to the administration, they would give her permission to go and do research. But her immediate head of department would not write directly to her, and neither would she write directly to the immediate head of department at the beginning. There are several correspondences at the end of the autobiography that brings out these kind of subtle institutional discrimination. So some of these letters, the exchange between Ankrah and the head of her department and the deans and the vice chancellor have words that explain this kind of difference and discrimination that was going on. There's a letter from the dean to the head of department of social work and social administration, which I want to quote, which is on page 261 of the autobiography. And in that letter, the vice chancellor writes, in this letter, the dean asks the head of the department to write to the vice chancellor and request him to relieve Ankrah of her duties so that she can go and work with UVRI so that they employ another person, because her position in the department is actually not being taken, and then the department is overstaffed. When Ankrah receives that letter, actually, when the dean receives the head of department receives that letter, she writes to Ankrah and asks Ankrah, the head of department's letter to the vice chancellor has this content. I might add here that Dr. Ankrah's aides, there's something that's covering it. Just a second. I have to read from my paper. I might add here that Dr. Ankrah's AIDS research and contribution in this area have been a guarded secret. And I want to put a point on that word, a guarded secret. Neither of the senior members of this department nor the other academic staff of this faculty know about it. I wonder what value that knowledge is if the colleagues of the university have no access to it. So this letter is written to Ankrah and to the dean and to the vice chancellor. Now the dean writes back to the vice chancellor and copies the secretary appointments board, requests that Ankrah be relieved of her duties. And I quote, it says, recruit someone else with more time and interest in the program. Ankrah is not copied in the letter. So these kinds of exchanges, could they be considered forms of discrimination where a letter is used to try to sideline an academic member of staff because of what she's doing? And this brings us to be interested in institutional politics. Academic staff members and their work outside, they're expected to do outreach. To what extent can they do outreach without violating the code of conduct, the code expected of them of teaching? So in one of the letters that Ankrah writes, while demanding that the head of department should give her a copy of this letter, the last one that I'm talking about, to the vice chancellor, that is written to the appointments board, she asks that she needs a copy of that letter. And the dean scribbles a comment on Ankrah's letter, and this is in handwriting. The comment says, Maxine, are you putting up a circus show or what? I've communicated to you verbally and in writing. I'm sure you have the letter to the Vice Chancellor. What then are you trying to exhibit? And the choice of words here are very, very interesting. What are you trying to exhibit? This is the dean writing to a member of staff, and he concludes by saying, personally, I am not impressed. What can a woman scholar exhibit when she asks for a letter from her dean? These are some of the questions that we need to ask. And we look at the language and the words that are being used here. So Ankrah, using words, writes a 7-page letter on typewriter to the dean and copies to the appointments board and to the head of department. And because we don't have much time, I won't go into the details of the letter, but the letter itself is another way that I feel is like a communication of her anger, her desperation. And in that letter, she brings out several issues about her position in the department, about her relationship with the dean, and concludes and says, if I am going to be victimized because of this letter, so be it, but I'm explaining my position. I'm a researcher, I'm a scholar, and I was doing this research with the permission from the Vice Chancellor. Other forms of subtle discrimination that can also be seen in the autobiography includes when she asks for leave without copying the immediate head of department. And I'm not taking one side, I just ask questions as a scholar. Is it right for an academic staff to write and ask for leave straight from the Vice Chancellor without copying her head of department or without copying the dean? And what does it communicate? It also communicates some kind of lack of communication that is coming in, and this comes in with a result of the miscommunication and the disagreement that is already existing that we see in the autobiography. So the language of communication brings out subtle forms of hostility that breeds eventually discrimination that makes Ankrah eventually leaves Makerere University, and she goes into the women's worlds. And then she becomes now an activist, and that was in 1984. So institutional discrimination is something that's complex, that's difficult to understand. In this case, I read in the element of gender, sex discrimination, because in all this, the people who were communicating with her were the male, the head of department was male, and the dean was also male. But there is the Vice Chancellor who was male, but he wasn't as hostile as the others. So to understand institutional discrimination, I look at Sylvia Tamale's recent work and try to understand how might we analyze this form of discrimination that seems to be hidden. In her recent book on decolonization, Tamale writes, writes about the hidden form of discrimination. And this, she says, it shapes, Sylvia Tamale in a recent book writes about the hidden from view issues that shape and are shaped by gender dynamics for female academics at Makerere University. And citing another female scholar, Alice Kagoda, she says, there are no formal obstacles that prevent women from achieving their goals within Makerere University as an institution, rather than hegemonic masculinity. So this kind of masculinity where women, female academic members of staff are expected to follow hierarchy or not to do research that brings in much more money than their male heads of departments, brings in a kind of discrimination that cuts across. It's a subtle discrimination, and it's something that I think we need to theorize. Tamale goes on to say, African universities remain products of colonial patriarchal legacies where women are trying to penetrate and break through. So in order to penetrate and break through, you have to deal with this kind of subtle discrimination. And she refers to other scholars. Amina Mama talks about this, Tripp and Kwesiga 2000, talk about this, and also the Makerere logo, Let Us Be Men, which has changed. But how much of this has changed? If we look at deeply into subtle forms of discrimination, we look at meritocracy. You are promoted based on merit. But when you're promoted based on merit, and there's equal opportunity, we have to look at the competitive environment and see, can women compete equally with the men, given what women go through? And do we need to consider those kinds of meritocracy that do not think about the gender dynamics that the female scholar goes through? Then the emphasis on publication ignores the fact that women still have to play the role of the good wife, and this has led women academicians to redefine their roles in the academia. Ankrah was already a woman who was not within her reproductive age, but you could see that there was that subtle form of unease between her and her male heads. Ezati 2004 explains that female academicians have refined their roles in 3 ways in order to fight this kind of discrimination. Some withdraw and they keep the peace. Others address the problem directly, like the way Ankrah would address the problem and write to the deans and protest against being relieved of her appointment without discussing with her. And others redefine their roles. They negotiate, but they try as much as possible to work around the discrimination. And I'm almost ending. So shedding the baggage of discrimination that Ankrah talks about. I asked the question, did she eventually shed the baggage when she moves out of Makerere University and starts her organization? And I didn't put a slide to this. She still says when the workers were coming and they would want to talk to the owner of the premise, the Ankrah Foundation, they would ask her that they want to talk to the owner, meaning that she is, as a woman, is not really the owner. It's the husband who is the owner. So it's that kind of gender expectations that still looks at women as not quite equal to men. So Ankrah concludes her autobiography, nevertheless, by acknowledging that she has been relieved of her burden of discrimination in Africa, bringing the narrative to the climax. And I quote, she says, surprisingly, the shedding of baggage in order to live fully, to be who I am to be, has occurred in the least likely place, according to America's perception, in Africa. Perhaps I am now home. As she concludes her narrative, Ankrah acknowledges that Africa made her exist in our own person, in fighting those forms of discrimination, whether it was racial, whether it was gender discrimination. She was excited, and that she has left a legacy that has been remembered. Unlike, and she says, if she had stayed in the US, her name would probably have disappeared. A little would be known of any of the Ankrahs, but in Africa, she has made a name. So at the end of her autobiography, she makes this statement, Africa is my adopted continent. Africa, defined as any of the cities listed earlier, Anomabu, Accra, Nairobi, Kampala, never had, nor would ever deter me from being the mark I wanted to be. Amazingly, there have been many Maxines over the decades, as the foregoing chapters show. If there is a vision and drive, these cities will open vistas to capitalize on the opportunities to instill that which is new and powerful for change. Gridlocks of racism or barriers of whatever kind cannot render one perpetually bound. I have observed that Africa permits one to break loose, if one does, from all systems that enslave, if the will exists. And I think this is a very powerful conclusion to her autobiography, showing that resilience actually helps. And if you have a good mindset, you can fight discrimination. And she says, surprisingly, the shedding of the baggage in order to live fully, to be who I am, is actually taking place here. And Africa is now home to her. And in 1982, Ankrah acquired a certificate of permanent residence in Uganda, where she has made herself a home in a district called Mukono. Mukono is not a district, it's a village called Mukono, a town called Mukono, and she runs the Ankrah Foundation after the death of her husband, Suman Kodwo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ebila. This was a very interesting presentation, and I'm very sure that your audience have been very much enlightened. Yes, so now we open the floor for questions, for suggestions, and for any comments. So what we'll do is, Dr. Ebila, you would take about 3 of them at a time and then try to respond to them. If anybody cannot ask a question directly, the person could post the question or comment or whatever in the chat box, and I'll pick it from there. So if anybody would want to, okay. So we have Edith Natukunda. Yes.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
It's so powerful to see such a good listenership. And we are from Makerere University. I am Professor Edith Natukunda Togboa from Makerere University, European Languages. We feel empowered by such a great talk. Now, my comment is on the intra-racial discrimination, or the discrimination which in the text we feel between Black and Black. I wonder if it could give us any depth of analysis if we considered theories relating to identity, because I think there is a way we interpret our identity and link it to our origins, and it somehow gets narrower and narrower, and we fail to get the whole. Although we talk about Ubuntu and being together and living in a community, finally, when you get to talk about the people of the east of your district and the west of your district, when it is referring to resources, for example, competitive resources, or in this case, emotional attachments, then we start splitting the hairs, and we pit the east against the west of just a district. And therefore, I don't know if we could use those theories on identity and ethnicity to also understand how adopted, in quotes, she may have looked to the community. Dr. Maxine Ankrah may have looked to the community that was welcoming her, and therefore, because of their local they are localized, they are contextualized interpretation of the identity. Maybe they were comparing and they were not finding her fitting according to the criteria of that specific context. In brief, could we look at her rejection or her intraracial discrimination that is discussed in the paper as also a crisis of identity in Africa? Thank you.
Thank you. So we would have next Kweku Dako to ask his question. Please make it brief.
Okay, thank you very much, Doc. Dr. Maxine Ankrah is my auntie. That's my uncle's wife. With regard to this question, the topic on the discrimination, I want to ask the presenter that if he really also did not look at the issue as a particular issue that existed within the academia and not necessarily a female-male sort of contestation within the academic space. I ask this because when you look at Tony Falole's work, that is the autobiography, A Mouth Sweeter Than Salt, an African memoir, he also made mention of how he had frictions with the old academic staff in the University of Ibadan. And as a result, he sometimes faced a lot of roadblocks that he was even unable to even initiate some of the ideas he has brought from America to teach in the university. So I want to see, is it only the female women that suffer this? No, it is just a general thing that happened between the old academics and the emerging academics in the university. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we move on to Chichi Sachikunye.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ebila. I am honestly, really, this was amazing because it helped me to understand a lot about myself. To make it very short, I was living in South Africa for quite a long time, and I experienced xenophobia and also racism. And I wanted to ask you, in the sense of narrative therapy, I'm trying to understand the difficulties and experiences I had. So then, what is narrative therapy or narrative and a meta-narrative? I just wanted to ask, what do you think would be the difference? Is there an overlap? Are there similarities in terms of frictions and conflicts, narrative and meta-narratives? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll allow Dr. Gillard to respond to these three, and then we'll continue. Thank you very much. Dr. Ebila.
Thank you very much for the wonderful questions and comments. I'll start with the Professor Natukunda's question. Might it be possible to use theories of identity and ethnicity? Sure, I think using theories of identity would work in this case to understand the intra-racial discrimination. And there are various examples of intra-racial discriminations that she talks about, especially, and I didn't even bring this. This is in between intra-racial, but also institutional discrimination. She asserts and says, and she doesn't say it directly, but she said it might be possible that because she was an African American, that was the reason why she did not get to be the first head of department of the School of Women and Gender Studies. The Ugandans were looking for a Ugandan, and therefore they felt that giving this to her would be like gifting it out, and it wouldn't be localized. So theories of identity would help us to understand some of these forms of discrimination that are subtle. Then Kweku, this is really interesting. I didn't know that she was your aunt. She's a great woman. I wanted to invite her to the talk, but I thought, no, you don't, let's first gossip and then I'll go and talk to her later. It might not be right just to have her here. But You're asking, is this a female thing? For sure, no, it's not a female thing. It's the form of discrimination that people suffer within the academia cuts across. And when I was doing my interview, when I was talking to scholars in Ghana, I talked to Professor Akona Kwabena, and we just discussed this and we said, these are things that we need to talk about in the academia. Sometimes academics suffer quietly and they think they are the ones being targeted, and yet it happens. So she has the courage to open up and talk about it as a woman. But the angle that's different here is for her to be targeted as a woman and someone to write to her and tell her, what are you trying to exhibit? I am not interested. That seems to me to be sexualized, to be talking about her trying to appear, to use her, actually to use her sexuality to abuse her, if I read that rightly. And then Sisi, thank you very much for the question. Narrative therapy, what would be the difference if I use that? I think telling a story, it has been proven that if you suffer a form of trauma and you talk about it, then eventually the baggage is lifted. And this is what Ankrah is trying to tell us, that much as there were all these roadblocks into her life, then she overcame it. So I haven't yet read a lot about narrative therapy. I read about trauma and the use of autobiography as trauma, and I write about it when I'm discussing the autobiographies of former child soldiers. But the use of narrative therapy has its own advantages and disadvantages. In fact, in our recent article with Devon Curtis and Maria, we try to question the origin of narrative therapy, whether it's coming in from the outside or whether it's coming in from the individual. And sometimes it's used to force the agenda that's coming from the outside. I think I'll leave that at that point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ebila. Now we'll take questions from Dr. Nab and then Isaac Kiza.
Good.
Dr. Nab.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Ebila, for the wonderful presentation and the analysis. My name is Dr. Florence Nab, University of Ghana School of Nursing and Midwifery. In fact, my background is, my primary background is science, but I also have a secondary background in gender studies. And so my comment is gender related. In fact, from the analysis, I can tell that Ankrah suffered what we call academic bullying as a woman in academia. And I'm sure that's part of it that she calls the baggage. In today's academia, a lot of women can still relate to her suffering. And so this baggage still exists. So I'm wondering, did she offer any solutions to women in academia, you know, as to how to survive and in academia, trying to drop this baggage so they can move on and compete with their counterpart males? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isaac Kiza.
Thank you so much. Florence, thank you for this and for forcing me into, what do you call it, autobiography, something like that. I'm just quite interested with, rather interested in, and I don't know if you talk about this or you've thought about this, the double-sidedness of what we call peripheral identities. In this case, someone comes to Uganda and they are black. They're Black Americans, is it? I hope I got this right. I hope I'm not making a mistake here. But they have a kind of thing whether they have to struggle with the idea of who they are as Blacks, even within a Black community. And I think you've talked about that as intra-racial discrimination. This double double-sided nature of these peripheral identities, and especially when she comes here and she really is in a space of privilege and the attack on privilege. I don't know how you think about privilege feeling peripheral in nature, and whether you've thought about this, and how that peripheral nature of privilege then becomes sometimes a very complex space within which a Black woman academic can work within a Black and African, and in this case, a Ugandan university. And I'm thinking about this in the broader ways in which sometimes we also construct gender identities, peripheral identities, and privileged identities, and how sometimes we probably want to be careful about how we imagine that specific identities are privileged, yet sometimes they see themselves with a totally interesting baggage of what we could again then start seeing as an identity that they feel is really under oppression. So I'm just thinking about this and how you as a gender scholar think through them. Thank you.
Okay, so Dr. Ebila, you may take up this.
Okay. Thank you very much, my sister, Dr. Florence Nab. She spoiled me when I was in Ghana. Thank you, and I'm happy that you are able to attend. Did she offer solutions? She actually does not directly say you should do this, but from what she narrates about how she fought it, she said, I have always been, she always goes back to her mantra. You can be what you want to be. That's what her father, she discussed with her father. And then she said, I knew that I was an excellent academic. I offered no sex and I don't kneel before others. So I knew I was performing at the highest level. So I just left everybody and continued excelling. That was her way of trying to ignore the kind of discrimination that was playing around her. And she doesn't say people should do that as such, but from what we can glean is just focus on doing your best and the rest will fall. And she said when things didn't work, she decided to get out of the academia without any baggage. And her life, reflecting on the title of the book, A Life Without Baggage, is always that if things work, you make them work. If they don't work, move on. You can still do better elsewhere. Then Isaac's question, thank you, Isaac, for attending. One of also my very peers whom we discuss things with, and I'm going to follow you up. We're going to talk about this. The double-sided nature of this identity. I think when I was introducing the theory of double consciousness, I tried to brush and talk about this double identity, this duality that is there. You feel you belong and yet you don't belong, and that influences her interaction with people. But what you're bringing in that's quite new is the privileged position and the peripherality of that kind of identity, which can also make you be an outsider. That brings in the other, it's not even a double-sidedness, it's perhaps a triple side of the kind of consciousness where you feel that, you know, I am privileged, but at the back of her mind, she, in her explanation, she comes from a very poor background. And at the end of the autobiography, she's acknowledging that Africa has made her what she is and she has made a name. If she had remained in the US, she probably wouldn't have made the kind of name that she has made. So there's a privilege that's coming in here, and the privilege that also the indigenous people are recognizing this person as an outsider. They don't know the baggage that she's carrying. So it brings in a complex nature that sometimes can clash. And perhaps these were some of the reasons why she was clashing with the establishment. She knew more and she had experienced other forms of discriminations and was talking against discrimination from this background, because she was not the type of person who would be attacked and she would keep quiet. She would write a 3-7-page response. the head of department writes to her in the morning, there's a response in the evening, and she files all her letters, and she has attached all of them at the back of the autobiography. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have about some 10 minutes to take any more. If there are any more comments or questions, we have about 10 more minutes to do that.
Yeah, there are about
Doc, my name is okay.
Yeah, there are many people's hands up there.
Unfortunately, I don't see.
Oh, there are 4 hands up.
Yeah,
Right.
so Mary can go, and then
okay, all right. If you can see that, okay. I seem not right.
Okay. Thank you. So my name is Mary Ayum. I'm a final year PhD candidate at the Institute of African Studies. I'm also working on Ghanaian women's autobiographies. Dr. Ebila, thank you for your presentation, and I join others to describe this autobiography as a very courageous one. Coming from the culture of silence and the fact that African women need to be in their proper woman, I want to refer you to 2 autobiographies that you can use to expand the sources of discrimination. So in the Ghanaian context, actresses also face this kind of discrimination. The book is titled A Toast to Life, and it's written by Juliet Ibrahim. And in her case, being a fair-colored actress, she describes the fact that whenever there's a role for a woman who will be a husband snatcher, who will be a wicked girlfriend, and all of those stereotypical roles, she's always casted based on her color, that she can be that kind of person. So she writes extensively about that in her autobiography. And former academic, the late Professor Irama Adi, also talks about a time in the US when she applied for a job, and she had a qualification, but because she was a woman, she was asked to reapply. They didn't really give her any explanation as to why they were not giving her the job. And she had discussions with others, and they wanted her to go back and find out and plead for the job. And she said no, because she has the qualification, she will not even go and beg for it. She will look elsewhere. And I think I agree, I cite that as a form of resilience. So thank you very much. I'll send you the titles of the book again in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. I think we have Dr. Abubakar and then Susanna Ude. And then with these 2, I think we'll bring proceedings to an end. Yes.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Ebila. It's really been very exciting. And I'm also working on a biography, and I've learned a lot on what to do and how to go about it. Thank you very much for that. I think my comment follows what Mary and Kweku said earlier. So sort of reiterating, talking about the gender discrimination. So my comment was actually on what she faced in academia. I was thinking was not really or necessarily related to the fact that she's a diasporian or she has this African American background, because we may not be able to say that women who were in her space, who were Ugandan, and by extension Africans, do not face similar sort of discrimination at their workplaces. So it sort of goes back to what Mary is saying with the examples that she gave. So she has a background, or could we say that is general, something that women suffer in that academic space? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we'll have Susanna. Maybe she will be the last person.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to ask question. And thanks, Florence, for really great presentation. I think that, well, I really appreciate how you structured also the narrative into 3 levels of gendered or intersection discrimination. And I would like to ask you if you can maybe a bit like elaborate on the intellectual recolonization of the discrimination within the UN agencies. I know that you focused more on the institutional setting within the Makerere University, but I was actually wondering how you interpret the relationship between these two and Ankrah's like strategies and struggles against these two different forms of discrimination. If you can maybe compare these two, how you interpret it in her narrative. Thanks.
Okay.
Right, Dr. Ebila, yeah.
I think there's one more last hand from Titi, maybe.
Titi, do you still have your hand up, or is the old one?
It's a new hand.
It's a new
yes,
hand.
it's a new hand.
So you'd have to make it very brief then.
Okay, yes. Once again, Dr. Ebila, I really found your presentation extremely rich and remarkable because I literally lived in South Africa for 14 years and I never got the permanent residency. And I did experience that racism, the intra-racism, which has now exploded into xenophobia. It can be covert, specialized, low level, and your presentation really helped me find healing. So thank you very much.
All right. So I would say that Florence is interesting that at the end of the day, Ankrah seems to have settled down well. And then she concludes that, yes, Africa is her home. So I tend to think that perhaps what she felt as discrimination and all that was due to cultural differences. So one can say that after getting used to the culture, she was able to settle. So I'm not sure whether as at now, currently, she would still say that she was discriminated against.
Okay.
Hello? Yes.
Can I respond now?
Yes, please. And then the first two.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Ansa. Thank you for introducing me to Mary. And we've talked a lot. She's a great student of yours. And Mary, thank you for those two autobiographies. I know you said you'd connect me to how to get them online. We'll talk about that outside this presentation. And also, Hasiatu, you say gender discrimination, what she faced in the academia was not perhaps just because she was an African American, anyone else could have faced. It's possible because the institutional forms of discrimination that I'm talking about cut across, and that's why I'm using now intersectionality. It could be because she was either on the peripheral of privilege and looked at as privileged and winning grants all the time because she was a woman. It could also be because she was the other. She was in the know and well connected, or it could be that she could have maybe not been looked at as equal to the males. So there's an element of gender masculinity affecting the way they interacted with her. Then Susanna, you said you didn't quite understand the work of the UN agencies and that the kind of discrimination that took place. I didn't have a lot of time to explain this. So Ankrah wins a grant and she does research in Uganda to find out how can HIV/AIDS be stopped. The emphasis at that time in 1986 was ABC, abstinence, be faithful, and use a condom. And when she goes to the communities as a social worker, she has that skill. She uses her skill to find out what has made you stop. And most of the findings that she's getting is not even talking about condom use. It's about just change of behavior. So she comes and she writes extensively as a social worker that if we sensitize people enough and told them the dangers of HIV, they would actually stop risky behaviors. But because the UN was at that point promoting a lot of use of condoms, this was a threat. So later, she forgot about this until when Epstein And in the autobiography, there are lots of textual references. Sometimes she extracts a whole text from Epstein and brings it. And Epstein says, it was your research. Had we been told about this, Africa would have taken a different trend and they would have known they're on the right way to stopping HIV/AIDS. But the emphasis was always on condom use. So I'm thinking that these UN agencies, and she mentions that, the UN agencies want to feel that their intervention is relevant. So because of that need to feel relevant, a scholar's work is left out until other scholars excavate it. That's subtle. It's not direct, but it's definitely trying to put her aside. So that's it briefly. And then Sissy, thank you so much. I'm so happy that you appreciated my presentation. And since we are working, I see that many of the people in the audience are working on autobiography. I think we should create a platform where we can share our research, where we can share information about African women's and men's autobiographies. If you are also writing on men's autobiographies, I would be very happy to keep in touch with everyone. I think those are the final comments I'm having. Unless there's something else, I just want to really express my gratitude to Dr. Mercy Akrofi. It's really wonderful that you were able to share this and I was able to get all this feedback. I'm going to put them in my writing and then prepare the article for the journal.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ebila. It's been a very stimulating presentation. We have learned a lot, the types of discrimination strategies to overcome. Because I must say that even sometimes within one's own family, one feels discriminated against. So with this, I'm sure we'll be able to build strategies to overcome. Thank you so much. So over to you, Dr. Mba, for any closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Akrofi. Excellent sharing. I can't believe it's at exactly 90 minutes.
Yeah.
So very few people can achieve that. So, and thank you, Florence. Thank you once again, our audience, for joining us. Maybe, Florence, just in terms of that connection, that creating linkages, maybe you want to share your email address via the chat so that those who want to connect can then, from there, you can have some communication.
Sure, let me write it down. Okay, so that's my email.
Okay, so as usual, we are going to stop recording. Maybe those who may wish to say hi to the presenter and then, or have some other brief conversation for 2 minutes, then we can end the meeting altogether.